Among the seven wonders of the ancient world, one stands apart, not for its grandeur, but for its mystery. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were said to defy gravity, lush terraces overflowing with exotic plants, built in the heart of the desert by a king for his homesick queen. Yet no ruins, no inscriptions, no Babylonian texts confirm their existence. Archaeologists have searched for centuries, finding nothing. Some now believe the gardens weren't in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, 300 miles away, built by a rival king. So were the gardens real, misplaced, or simply imagined by ancient storytellers? A wonder lost in time, or a myth that bloomed in the minds of poets? In the ancient imagination, no city loomed larger than Babylon. Rising on the banks of the Euphrates, it was a place of monumental walls, bustling markets, and temples that sought to touch the heavens. Among its marvels, one wonder stood apart: the Hanging Gardens. Described as tiered terraces of green rising above the desert plain, irrigated by ingenious devices, and filled with exotic plants, they were said to have been built for love, a king's gift to his queen who longed for her mountainous homeland. For centuries, travelers, historians, and poets spoke of this wonder, and yet, strangely, no trace has ever been found. The Hanging Gardens occupy a unique place among the seven wonders of the ancient world. Unlike the Great Pyramid of Giza, whose stones still pierce the sky, or the Colossus of Rhodes, whose fragments are recorded in archaeology, the gardens leave no physical remains. Their existence is preserved only in words. In the accounts of Greek historians such as Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and Philo of Byzantium, these descriptions, written centuries after Babylon's zenith, speak of terraces rising like mountains, watered by hidden machinery, filled with trees that cast shade over courtyards. They conjure an image of paradise in the midst of Mesopotamia's arid plain. The story most often told is one of love. According to later sources, King Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned in the 6th century BCE, built the gardens for his wife, Amytis of Media. Longing for the forests and hills of her homeland, she found Babylon's flat, sun-baked plains suffocating. To ease her sorrow, Nebuchadnezzar ordered a mountain built within the city, its terraces planted with trees and flowers, its roots nourished by ingenious irrigation. The legend portrays a ruler not only as a conqueror of cities, but as a gardener of paradise, bending nature to love. Yet when we turn to Babylonian records, the silence is striking. Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions, which boast of his temples, walls, and palaces, never mention the gardens. Babylonian chronicles, so detailed about his reign, are mute on this marvel. Archaeology, too, has failed to uncover definitive traces of the gardens in Babylon itself. The Greek descriptions exist, but the Babylonian silence haunts them. Were the gardens real? Were they misremembered? Or were they a fantasy born of longing for Eden in the desert? This information has not been verified. What we know of Babylon itself makes the legend plausible. Nebuchadnezzar II transformed the city into a metropolis of unparalleled grandeur. He rebuilt its walls, constructed vast palaces, and restored the Temple of Marduk, known as Sagila. The Ishtar Gate, decorated with blue-glazed bricks and striding beasts, still testifies to his ambition. It is not inconceivable that such a ruler, with vast resources and engineering skill, could have commissioned terraced gardens. The Babylonians were masters of irrigation, drawing lifeblood from the Euphrates to sustain their fields. If any civilization could have raised a mountain of greenery in the desert, it was Babylon. Greek descriptions of the gardens emphasize their engineering as much as their beauty. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes terraces supported by stone columns, rising in stages like a theater, with hollow spaces filled with soil deep enough for trees. Diodorus Siculus adds that water was raised by mechanical devices, perhaps an early screw or chain pump, hidden from view to astonish visitors. The emphasis on irrigation reflects awe at Babylonian mastery of water in an unforgiving land. These accounts, though written centuries later, suggest not only fantasy but memory of real techniques. Still, the contradictions are many. While later writers credit Nebuchadnezzar, an earlier account by Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BCE, mentions no such construction. Some modern scholars have suggested that confusion with Nineveh, the Assyrian capital to the north, may explain the mystery. Sennacherib, the Assyrian king of the 7th century BCE, recorded the creation of gardens at Nineveh with irrigation canals bringing water from distant mountains. His inscriptions describe engineering feats akin to those later attributed to Babylon. Perhaps Greek travelers, centuries removed, conflated Babylon with Nineveh, transferring the wonder south to the more famous city. Whether the Hanging Gardens stood in Babylon, in Nineveh, or only in imagination, their place among the 7 wonders reveals more about human longing than about historical certainty. They symbolize the dream of paradise in hostile landscapes, the desire to impose beauty and abundance where nature offers only dust and heat. They are remembered because they speak to something universal, the hope that love and ingenuity can make a garden bloom in the desert. The absence of evidence is itself part of their allure. Unlike the Great Pyramid, the gardens remain elusive, a mystery that invites speculation. Were they real, their remains buried beneath the sands or Euphrates silt? Were they a marvel of Nineveh, misattributed to Babylon by Greek storytellers? Or were they an invention, a legend woven from fragments of memory and myth? The uncertainty makes them timeless. Every generation, encountering the silence of ruins, fills it with imagination. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are thus a wonder twice over, a wonder of engineering, if they existed, and a wonder of storytelling, because they endure in memory despite their absence in stone. They remind us that wonders are not only built of brick and mortar, but of words and dreams. The gardens may never have risen in Babylon's dust, but they have grown in the imagination of humanity for over 2 millennia. In the saga of the 7 wonders, the Hanging Gardens stand apart. The Great Pyramid can be measured, the Temple of Artemis can be excavated, the Lighthouse of Alexandria can be reconstructed from texts and archaeology. But the Hanging Gardens remain elusive, more myth than monument, more echo than evidence. They are proof that human wonder does not always require certainty. Sometimes it thrives best in mystery. And so, the story begins, a city of walls and temples, a king of ambition, a queen of longing, a mountain of gardens rising against the desert sky, or perhaps only a tale told by travelers, a mirage of memory. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, real or imagined, remain one of humanity's greatest stories of love, ingenuity, and the fragile line between history and legend. If the Hanging Gardens truly existed in Babylon, there is only one ruler whose vision and resources could have made them possible, Nebuchadnezzar II. His name is inseparable from the city's golden age, when Babylon became not only the capital of an empire, but the symbol of Mesopotamian grandeur. Reigning from 605 to 562 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar was conqueror, builder, and patron. His armies humbled Jerusalem, his masons raised the Ishtar Gate, and his engineers reshaped the very course of rivers. If ever a king could command a mountain of gardens to rise in the desert, it was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's rise was forged in war. The son of Nabopolassar, founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he first distinguished himself on the battlefield at Carchemish in 605 BCE, where he crushed the Egyptians and their Assyrian allies. That victory secured Babylon's dominance over the Near East. Succeeding his father soon after, Nebuchadnezzar embarked on decades of campaigns, extending his empire from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. His military power was formidable, but his legacy was not only conquest. Where other kings were remembered for wars, Nebuchadnezzar was remembered for walls, temples, and gardens. Babylon itself became his canvas. Archaeological remains and cuneiform inscriptions reveal the scope of his building program. He reconstructed the Great Walls, making the city nearly impregnable. He restored and expanded the Esagila temple complex, dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's chief deity. He built new palaces, gates, and processional ways. His most famous creation, the Ishtar Gate, still survives in reconstructed form in Berlin, its blue-glazed bricks adorned with lions, bulls, and dragons. Through these works, Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into a metropolis of magnificence, one of the true wonders of the ancient world. It is within this context that the story of the Hanging Gardens fits. Later sources describe them as Nebuchadnezzar's response to his wife Amethyst's longing for the green mountains of Media. Babylon, flat and sun-scorched, offered none of the forests or meadows she knew. To soothe her homesickness, the king ordered the creation of an artificial mountain within the city, layered with terraces, planted with trees, and watered by ingenious irrigation. The gardens, if real, were thus both personal gesture and public display, a demonstration that the king could master nature itself, bending rivers and soils to his will. Greek writers emphasized the engineering required to sustain such a marvel. Diodorus Siculus wrote of terraces supported by stone vaults filled with deep soil for trees, while Strabo described mechanisms for raising water from the Euphrates. Ancient accounts even suggest a proto-screw pump or chain device hidden from view, making the irrigation appear miraculous. Whether these details were accurate or imaginative, they underscore the awe Nebuchadnezzar inspired. His city already dazzled visitors with its gates and temples. The gardens, if they existed, would have been the crowning touch. Yet here the silence of Babylonian sources grows troubling. Nebuchadnezzar left numerous inscriptions boasting of his achievements. On cylinders and tablets, he recorded the temples he built, the walls he strengthened, the palaces he raised. His pride in construction was immense. He wrote, "I have built this house in Babylon for the amazement of the people." But in none of his inscriptions is there mention of the Hanging Gardens. For a ruler so eager to claim credit for his works, this omission is striking. It leaves open questions. Did the gardens truly exist, or were they later legend? Were they built but not considered worthy of inscription, perhaps as a private work rather than a public monument? Or were Greek authors mistaken, attributing to Nebuchadnezzar what belonged to another king, another city? This information has not been verified. Still, circumstantial evidence keeps the theory alive. Babylonian engineers were certainly capable of such irrigation feats. The Euphrates flowed directly through the city, and canals diverted its waters across the plains. The Babylonians built ziggurats, stepped temple towers, whose design resembles the terraced form described for the gardens. The cultural value placed on lush greenery in arid Mesopotamia also supports the plausibility of such a project. Kings often boasted of creating gardens as symbols of prosperity and divine favor. In a land where shade was rare and water precious, to create a mountain of trees was to proclaim dominion over nature itself. The story of Nebuchadnezzar and Amytas also carries symbolic weight. Whether factual or not, it portrays the king as not merely a builder of walls, but of paradise. He becomes a figure of both might and tenderness, conqueror of nations, comforter of his queen. The tale reflects ancient ideals of kingship, the ruler who provides abundance, transforms the land, and creates harmony between power and love. Even if legend, it reveals how later generations imagined Nebuchadnezzar's character and Babylon's greatness. Modern excavations in Babylon, especially those led by Robert Coldway in the early 20th century, sought to find evidence of the gardens. Coldway identified a massive vaulted structure near the palace that he proposed was part of the terraces. Its unusual design, with thick walls and subterranean chambers, seemed to fit Greek descriptions. Yet other scholars argue it was a storeroom or part of a fortification. The lack of clear irrigation systems at the site weakens the identification. Without definitive remains, the theory of Nebuchadnezzar's gardens remains tantalizing but uncertain. Still, Nebuchadnezzar's reputation as a builder cannot be denied. Even if the Hanging Gardens were myth, his works reshaped Babylon into the marvel described by Herodotus and admired by later travelers. His Ishtar Gate and processional way, reconstructed brick by brick in museums, show a city that was already a wonder of the world. Whether or not he raised a mountain of greenery, he raised a city of stone and brick that dazzled all who entered its gates. Nebuchadnezzar's reign ended in 562 BCE, but his memory endured. To the Hebrews, he was the destroyer of Jerusalem and the captor of exiles, remembered with fear and bitterness. To the Babylonians, he was the builder king, restorer of temples and defender of the gods. To the Greeks and later writers, he became the romantic figure of the gardens, the monarch who built paradise in the desert. His image thus straddles history and legend, reality and imagination. If the Hanging Gardens were real, Nebuchadnezzar was their architect. If they were not, he was their inspiration, the figure upon whom later storytellers projected the wonder. In either case, his name is forever entwined with the gardens. Babylon was his city, and the gardens, whether stone and root or myth and memory, are his legacy. At the heart of the story of the Hanging Gardens lies not a king, but a queen. Amytis of Media, remembered in later sources as the wife of Nebuchadnezzar II, is the figure for whom the gardens were supposedly built. Her longing for the mountains of her homeland, so the story goes, inspired the creation of a paradise of terraces, trees, and flowing water in the flat, sun-scorched land of Babylon. Whether she truly lived as described, and whether her sorrow really inspired such a wonder, is uncertain. But in the legend of Amytis, the Hanging Gardens are given soul. They become not just an engineering marvel, but an act of love. Amytis' origins are traced to Media, a kingdom of the Iranian plateau, where mountains and highlands dominated the landscape. Her marriage to Nebuchadnezzar was likely a political alliance, uniting the Neo-Babylonian and Median realms in the early 6th century BCE. Such marriages were common tools of diplomacy, binding empires through blood ties. For Amytis, however, it meant leaving the cool, green hills of her homeland for the vast, arid plains of Mesopotamia. In contrast to Media's rugged landscapes, Babylon was flat, hot, and dust-filled, its beauty found in rivers and temples rather than forests and mountains. To a young queen transplanted to such a land, homesickness would have been natural. Later writers cast this homesickness as the seed of the gardens. According to Diodorus Siculus and others, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the construction of a terraced mountain within the city to replicate Amytis' homeland. Trees from distant lands, flowers of every color, vines cascading down walls, all were planted to create a microcosm of Media's green world. Ingenious irrigation lifted water from the Euphrates to nourish the greenery, making the terraces bloom in the desert air. In this tale, the gardens become more than spectacle. They are comfort, love materialized in stone and soil. The romantic image of Amytis standing among the terraces, inhaling the scent of pines and cedars, gazing at trees that reminded her of home, has echoed through centuries. It is an image of longing answered by devotion, of a king wielding the resources of empire not for conquest, but for the heart of his queen. Whether this story is true or not, it reveals how ancient and later cultures wanted to believe that wonders could spring from love. Yet history is silent about Amytis herself. Babylonian inscriptions do not mention her, and contemporary sources provide no details of her life. Her name and story appear only in later Greek accounts, centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Was she a real queen, remembered dimly in later tradition? Was she a literary invention, created to explain the presence of the gardens or to moralize about love and power? This information has not been verified. Even if Amytis is a figure of legend, the theme she embodies is consistent with ancient ideals of kingship. In Mesopotamian tradition, the ruler was not only a warrior, but also a provider, one who made the land fertile and abundant. Kings boasted of building canals, planting orchards, and creating gardens. To create greenery in arid lands was to demonstrate divine favor and royal power. A story of Nebuchadnezzar building a garden for his queen fits into this tradition, whether or not Amytis herself stood in its shade. The notion of gardens as political and emotional symbols is deeply rooted in Mesopotamian culture. The word paradisu, from which our word paradise derives, originally referred to walled gardens or hunting parks of kings. These were not merely recreational spaces, but signs of dominion over nature, controlled environments that displayed wealth, power, and order. If Nebuchadnezzar created a terraced paradise, it would have been both private comfort for Amytis and public demonstration of Babylon's mastery over land and water. The story of Amytis also reflects a universal human theme: exile and longing for home. Across history, queens married into foreign courts have carried the burden of leaving their homelands, and their nostalgia has shaped politics and culture. Amytis' supposed homesickness gave rise to a wonder of the world. Centuries later, medieval queens would bring fashions, foods, and traditions from their birthplaces into new kingdoms. Whether or not she was real, Amytas symbolizes the human cost of diplomacy, the loneliness of women used as pawns in imperial alliances, and the power of longing to reshape the world. Modern scholars debate whether the gardens were truly built for her. Some suggest the tale was a later romantic embellishment, grafted onto Greek accounts to explain a structure they could not otherwise account for. Others see in it a symbolic narrative, casting Nebuchadnezzar not only as builder of walls, but as gardener of paradise. In this reading, Amytas is less historical queen than allegorical figure. The fertile land, the foreign ally, the yearning for abundance answered by the king. Regardless of historicity, Amytas legend endures because it humanizes the wonder. Palaces and temples can be explained by politics and religion, but the gardens, at least in story, were built for love. That detail distinguishes them from the other wonders. The pyramid was built as a tomb, the lighthouse for navigation, the colossus for triumph. Only the gardens, in tradition, arose from affection, memory, and longing. They are the most human of the wonders, precisely because they may be the least real. If Amytas walked among terraces of cypress and cedar, she would have carried with her the paradox of the gardens, both paradise and exile. The gardens gave her home in a foreign land, yet they reminded her of the homeland she had lost. They were both gift and reminder, both comfort and ache. Perhaps that is why the story endures, because it reflects the bittersweet truth that even love cannot erase longing, but it can soften it with beauty. Today, when we imagine the Hanging Gardens, we imagine not only stone terraces and ingenious irrigation, but Amytas herself, a queen gazing across green slopes conjured from desert dust. Whether or not she lived, whether or not the gardens stood, her presence lingers in the legend. She is the spirit of the gardens, the reason they were said to exist. Without her, they would be only engineering. With her, they become story. If the Hanging Gardens of Babylon existed, they left no trace in Babylonian inscriptions or ruins, yet they flourished in Greek words. The world remembers the gardens not because of Nebuchadnezzar's tablets or Babylonian reliefs, but because Greek historians and travelers wrote about them centuries later. Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and other writers of the Hellenistic and Roman eras preserved descriptions that painted the gardens as one of the most astonishing sights of antiquity. Their accounts, though inconsistent, are the foundation of the legend. Without them, the Hanging Gardens would likely have been forgotten altogether. The first detailed Greek description comes from Diodorus Siculus, a historian writing in the 1st century BCE. Drawing on earlier sources such as Ctesias of Cnidus, Diodorus describes the gardens as a massive structure rising like a mountain, with terraces built one above another, supported by stone vaults. Each level was filled with deep soil to accommodate large trees, while exotic plants cascaded down the walls. Ingenious irrigation devices lifted water from the Euphrates, unseen by the viewer, creating the illusion of natural springs. The image is one of marvel, a man-made mountain of greenery, defying the desert around it. Strabo, the geographer of the 1st century CE, adds further detail. He emphasizes the engineering of the terraces, describing them as constructed like a theater, rising in steps, each covered with earth deep enough for trees. He too notes the mechanical devices that raised water, hidden within the structure, a feat of technology as wondrous as the greenery itself. For Strabo, the gardens were not only beautiful but ingenious, a marriage of nature and engineering that testified to human skill. Philo of Byzantium, another ancient writer, praised the gardens as an expression of art conquering nature, a triumph of architecture that made the impossible possible. His account highlights the philosophical dimension. The gardens were not only a marvel to behold, but an idea, a statement about humanity's ability to reshape the environment. Taken together, these Greek accounts create the enduring image of the Hanging Gardens, terraced, irrigated, lush, and astonishing. Yet they also raise questions. None of these writers saw the gardens themselves. Strabo and Diodorus wrote centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's reign, relying on earlier sources that may have been secondhand or exaggerated. Ctesias, whose lost work influenced later writers, was notorious for embellishment. The descriptions vary in detail, suggesting either differing traditions or imaginative reconstruction. The Greek witnesses gave the world the gardens, but they may also have given the world a mirage. The problem deepens when compared to Babylonian silence. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions boast endlessly of his works: the Ishtar Gate, the Great Walls, the temples of Marduk, but never mention the gardens. No Babylonian tablet describes terraces of greenery. Archaeological excavations in Babylon have uncovered palaces, fortifications, and temples, but no conclusive remains of the gardens. The contrast is stark. Greeks describe marvels. Babylonians remain mute. Why, then, did the Greeks believe in the gardens? One answer lies in cultural perception. To Greek visitors, Mesopotamia was a land of wonders. Herodotus, though he never mentioned the gardens, described Babylon's walls and temples with awe. For outsiders, Babylon was a city of marvels, so the idea of a garden mountain seemed plausible. Moreover, Greek fascination with artificial landscapes, terraces, groves, paradises, may have predisposed them to accept and amplify stories of such a creation. Another answer lies in possible conflation. Some modern scholars suggest that Greek writers confused Babylon with Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. King Sennacherib of Assyria, a century before Nebuchadnezzar, left inscriptions describing vast gardens in Nineveh, irrigated by canals that brought water from distant mountains. He boasted of planting trees from across his empire, creating a paradise in the city. Archaeological excavations in Nineveh have uncovered aqueducts and canals that support his claims. It is possible that Greek accounts of the Hanging Gardens were based, at least in part, on memories of Nineveh's gardens, misattributed to Babylon, the city more famous in their time. Even if mistaken, the Greek accounts testify to the power of imagination. They reflect not only what may have existed, but what ancient people wanted to believe could exist. The gardens were a symbol of abundance in a world often marked by scarcity, of green paradise in desert lands, of human ingenuity triumphing over harsh environments. Whether fact or fiction, they filled a cultural need. The inconsistency among the Greek sources also reveals how legends evolve. Some emphasize love, Nebuchadnezzar building for Amytis. Others stress engineering, marveling at irrigation. Some describe the terraces as resembling a mountain, others as a theater. Each retelling reshaped the wonder, adapting it to new audiences and purposes. Over centuries, the Hanging Gardens became less a single place than a shared idea, a story retold in varying forms. Modern historians, aware of these contradictions, approach the Greek witnesses cautiously. Were they describing a real structure, distorted by time? Were they preserving memory of Nineveh rather than Babylon? Or were they perpetuating a myth, born from the human longing for paradise? This information has not been verified, yet it would be unfair to dismiss the Greek accounts entirely. They may not prove the gardens, but they keep alive the possibility. Without them, we would never know of the gardens at all. Their words preserve a memory, however distorted, of a wonder that continues to inspire. They show how history and legend intertwine, how memory survives not in stone, but in storytelling. The Greek witnesses thus gave birth to the legend of the Hanging Gardens. Whether they recorded reality, confusion, or imagination, their accounts ensured that the gardens entered the canon of the Seven Wonders, where they remain to this day. They remind us that wonders are as much about words as about walls, as much about what is seen as what is said. And so the gardens endure, not in ruins but in descriptions, not in stone but in sentences. Strabo and Diodorus may not have walked among their terraces, but through their words, countless generations have done so in imagination. For centuries, the Hanging Gardens were inseparably tied to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar too. Yet a growing body of scholarship suggests that perhaps the Greeks, and the world after them, may have placed the gardens in the wrong city altogether. Some historians argue that the marvel described in ancient texts was not in Babylon, but in Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, more than 300 kilometers to the north. If true, then one of the seven wonders of the ancient world is not Babylonian at all but Assyrian, created not by Nebuchadnezzar, but by King Sennacherib in the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE. Sennacherib ruled Assyria from 705 to 681 BCE, inheriting an empire that stretched from Mesopotamia to the Levant. Known to biblical history as the king who besieged Jerusalem, he was also one of the most ambitious builders of the ancient Near East. His inscriptions proudly proclaim the transformation of Nineveh into a palace without rival. He expanded the city's walls, built a vast new royal palace, and most importantly, constructed elaborate gardens and waterworks that astonished even his contemporaries. His inscriptions describe them in detail, an extraordinary rarity when compared to the silence of Nebuchadnezzar's records regarding the Hanging Gardens. According to Sennacherib's texts, he created a garden filled with trees from across the empire: cedars, cypresses, fruit trees, and exotic plants. These gardens were irrigated not by chance, but by extraordinary engineering. Sennacherib constructed aqueducts, canals, and water-raising devices to channel water from distant mountains into Nineveh. One inscription boasts of building a massive aqueduct at Jerwin, made of stone blocks and waterproof cement, to carry water across valleys. Archaeological remains of this aqueduct still survive, a tangible testament to Assyrian engineering. The parallels with Greek descriptions of the Hanging Gardens are striking. Strabo and Diodorus spoke of terraces of greenery, irrigated by hidden machines. Sennacherib's inscriptions speak of terraced gardens nourished by mechanical devices that lifted water. They even mention bronze water screws, centuries before Archimedes is credited with inventing the device. If true, Assyria may have pioneered the screw pump technology later associated with Greek science. Why, then, did later writers place the gardens in Babylon rather than Nineveh? One reason may be Babylon's fame. By the time Greek historians were writing, Babylon had become legendary. Its massive walls, the Tower of Babel, its role in biblical texts all contributed to its renown. Nineveh, though mighty in its time, had been destroyed in 612 BCE, reduced to ruins. Babylon remained, and Nebuchadnezzar's name loomed large in Jewish and Greek memory. It is possible that travelers, recounting stories of extraordinary gardens, confused the two Mesopotamian cities, transferring the marvel to the more famous one. Another reason lies in cultural memory. The Babylonians themselves despised the Assyrians, who had ruled them harshly before their empire fell. When the Neo-Babylonians rose under Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, they inherited and adapted many Assyrian practices but erased Assyrian glory from memory. The Greeks, drawing on Babylonian informants, may have been told that Nebuchadnezzar was the great builder of marvels, while Assyrian achievements were forgotten or deliberately ignored. The Assyrian theory gained traction in modern scholarship thanks to the work of Stephanie Daly, an Assyriologist who carefully compared Greek descriptions with Sennacherib's inscriptions and archaeological findings. Daly argued that the level of engineering described by the Greeks is absent in Babylonian records but present in Assyrian ones. She identified the gardens mentioned by Sennacherib as the true Hanging Gardens, their memory later misattributed to Babylon. Her case is strengthened by the surviving aqueducts and canals, which show that Assyrians possessed both the ambition and means to sustain such a wonder. This information has not been verified. Excavations in Nineveh lend weight to the theory. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of terrace structures and water channels consistent with large-scale gardens. Reliefs from Sennacherib's palace depict lush landscapes with trees, vines, and flowing streams, images of cultivated paradise within the city. These visual records align with textual evidence and contrast with Babylon, where no comparable imagery or inscriptions have been found. Yet the theory remains controversial. Critics argue that the absence of evidence in Babylon is not proof of non-existence. Much of the city lies unexcavated or was destroyed by shifting Euphrates waters. They caution that attributing the gardens to Nineveh may be an overcorrection. Moreover, the Seven Wonders list, compiled by Greek writers, explicitly names Babylon, not Nineveh. Could they all have been mistaken? The debate ultimately highlights the difficulty of reconstructing ancient memory. Was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon truly in Babylon, built for Amytis by Nebuchadnezzar? Or were they in Nineveh, engineered by Sennacherib as part of his palace without rival? Perhaps the Greeks conflated both traditions, hearing echoes of Assyrian gardens but attaching them to Babylon, whose fame endured. What is certain is that the Assyrians created monumental gardens that fit the descriptions attributed to the Hanging Gardens. Their aqueducts, water screws, and terrace structures were real, not legend. If the gardens of Babylon never existed, then the gardens of Nineveh may deserve the title. In either case, the story reflects the ancient Mesopotamian ambition to create paradise on earth, bending rivers and soils to conjure green abundance in arid lands. The Assyrian theory enriches the legend rather than diminishes it. It shows that the Hanging Gardens were not merely fantasy, but grounded in real traditions of engineering and horticulture. Whether in Babylon or Nineveh, such gardens expressed the same ideals. Kings demonstrating power, love, and divine favor by creating life in barren places. The wonder remains, even if the geography shifts. Thus, the Hanging Gardens may not be lost after all. They may lie not in the ruins of Babylon, but in the terraces and aqueducts of Nineveh, their memory displaced yet preserved in Greek accounts. If so, then the wonder we call Babylonian is also Assyrian, a testament to the intertwined legacies of Mesopotamia. The question of location remains open, but the Assyrian theory reminds us that history and legend often merge, each shaping the other. The Hanging Gardens endure not because we know exactly where they stood, but because we do not. Mystery gives them life, and debate keeps them green in our imagination. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, whether in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar or in Nineveh under Sennacherib, would have been more than a spectacle of beauty. They would have been a triumph of engineering. To raise trees and flowers in an arid land, to sustain them on terraces of stone, to irrigate them year-round in a hot climate. This required not only imagination but mastery of hydraulic science. Ancient writers were fascinated less by the greenery itself than by the hidden machinery that kept it alive. Their accounts, combined with archaeological evidence and modern reconstructions, allow us to glimpse how such a paradise might have been made possible. The first challenge was structural. The gardens were described as rising in terraces, each layer filled with deep soil capable of supporting trees. Diodorus Siculus imagined them built like a theater, with stone vaults supporting the weight. Strabo described ascending stages, each level providing a platform for vegetation. To sustain such weight, builders would have needed massive stone foundations, reinforced with bitumen and lead to resist water seepage. Babylonian builders were experts in waterproofing, using bitumen to line canals and cisterns. Assyrian inscriptions likewise boast of innovative stonework, particularly in Sennacherib's aqueducts. Such techniques could have allowed terraces to bear the weight of soil, water, and trees. The second challenge was irrigation. Plants do not thrive on stone alone. They require constant water, particularly in Mesopotamia's scorching summers. Greek writers repeatedly mention devices for raising water from the Euphrates or from canals. Strabo speaks of screw-like mechanisms hidden within the terraces, while Diodorus describes hidden pumps that astonished visitors. These accounts hint at technologies that may have predated or inspired later inventions attributed to the Greeks. One possibility is the chain pump, a loop of buckets attached to a chain, pulled by hand or animal power, lifting water upward in continuous motion. Another is the water screw, later credited to Archimedes but perhaps used earlier. Sennacherib's inscriptions at Nineveh describe bronze cylinders that lifted water, which some scholars interpret as early water screws. If so, Assyrian engineers may have pioneered devices centuries before their supposed Greek invention. This information has not been verified. Once lifted, the water would have been distributed across terraces through channels and cisterns. Stone conduits lined with bitumen could carry streams across platforms, soaking soil and nourishing roots. Reliefs from Assyria depict elaborate irrigation systems, with water flowing through gardens and orchards. Babylon itself sat on the Euphrates, its canals feeding fields and date groves. Extending such systems vertically into terraces would have been a logical, if ambitious, innovation. The third challenge was horticultural. To create a mountain of greenery, kings would have needed plants from across their realms. Greek writers emphasize the exotic variety of trees: cedars, cypresses, fruit trees, flowering plants. Sennacherib's inscriptions boast of importing trees from distant mountains, planting them in Nineveh to create a replica of conquered landscapes. Nebuchadnezzar, if he built the gardens, may have done the same, drawing from Media, the Levant, and beyond. The result would have been a living collection of empire, a botanical microcosm of royal dominion. Such horticultural ambition was not unusual in Mesopotamia. Kings often created hunting parks and gardens as symbols of abundance. The Akkadian and Persian word paradisa, walled garden, gave rise to the later concept of paradise. To build gardens in the desert was to proclaim mastery over nature, to show that the king could create fertility where the gods gave only dust. The hanging gardens, in this sense, were political as much as romantic, a display of divine favor and royal control. The engineering of the gardens also carried symbolic weight. To the ancient viewer, water raised from the depths and made to flow on high terraces was miraculous. Rivers naturally flowed downward. To reverse them was to bend nature itself. Hidden pumps and channels turned technology into magic, reinforcing the king's aura of power. Visitors to the gardens would not only marvel at the trees, but at the mystery of how they survived, their roots drinking from unseen rivers. Modern reconstructions have attempted to visualize this marvel. Some imagine a ziggurat-like structure, with terraces stacked atop one another, covered in soil and greenery. Others see vaulted arcades supporting gardens above, like a massive stone platform. The reconstructed Ishtar Gate and palace walls at Babylon show that such architectural ambition was possible. The Jerwin Aqueduct at Nineveh proves that Assyrian engineers could channel water across vast distances. The pieces of the puzzle exist. What remains uncertain is how they were assembled. One intriguing possibility is that the gardens were not a single mountain-like structure, but a series of terraced courtyards within the palace. Excavations at Babylon uncovered vaulted rooms near the southern palace, which Robert Coldway identified as possible substructures of the gardens. Thick walls and unusual layouts suggested something more than storage. Critics, however, argue these were warehouses, not gardens. At Nineveh, reliefs of palace gardens suggest sprawling landscapes with artificial hills and streams, perhaps the true model of the wonder. What cannot be denied is the sophistication of Mesopotamian water management. The region's civilizations had, for millennia, mastered the art of irrigation, channeling rivers into canals, regulating floods, and sustaining agriculture in a harsh climate. The Hanging Gardens, if real, were the culmination of this tradition, a spectacular expression of techniques honed over centuries. They were not an anomaly, but an apex, the fusion of practical irrigation with monumental display. Engineering paradise was costly. Raising water continuously would have required manpower or animals, working day and night to keep terraces green. Maintaining terraces, preventing leaks, and replenishing soil demanded constant labor. The gardens, if they existed, were not only an engineering feat but a logistical one, a perpetual performance of abundance. They were less a static monument than a living system, one that testified daily to royal power and wealth. This may explain why no other wonder was like them. Temples, statues, pyramids could stand passively, requiring only minimal upkeep. Gardens demanded endless care. Their very ephemerality, trees that withered, flowers that died, soil that eroded, made them both more miraculous and more fragile. They embodied abundance, but required constant effort to maintain it. Perhaps this is why they vanished without trace. Once the kings fell, the waters stopped flowing, the terraces dried, and the gardens died. Stone can endure, trees cannot. In this sense, the engineering of the gardens reveals their paradox. They were both triumph and vulnerability. They showed what human ingenuity could achieve, raising rivers, sustaining paradise in desert air. But they also depended on endless work. When empires collapsed, the gardens collapsed with them. Their absence in archaeology is explained not only by confusion or destruction, but by the nature of gardens themselves. Once neglected, they vanish. Thus, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, if they existed, were not merely a wonder of beauty, but of engineering. They were a marriage of stone and soil, water and wood, technology and imagination. They proved that kings could command rivers, bend nature, and conjure paradise. And they remind us that all such marvels are fragile, dependent not only on brilliance, but on continuity. When continuity breaks, wonders wither. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon occupy a liminal space between history and legend. Unlike the pyramids, which rise visibly from the sands, or the Temple of Artemis, whose ruins can be traced, the gardens survive only in memory. Yet they endure as one of the most evocative of the seven wonders. Their power lies not in stone foundations, but in imagination, in the way they merged with myths of paradise and shaped humanity's vision of abundance in barren lands. In Mesopotamian tradition, gardens already carried deep symbolic weight. The word paradisu, from which paradise derives, meant a walled enclosure, often a royal park or orchard. Kings boasted of creating such paradises as signs of divine favor. They imported trees from distant lands, planted them in orderly rows, and irrigated them with canals. These spaces were not mere pleasure gardens. They were symbols of control over nature, microcosms of abundance in lands where survival depended on water management. The Hanging Gardens, if real, would have been the ultimate paradisu, not just a park but a mountain of greenery raised in the heart of the desert. The association of the gardens with paradise connects them to broader myths of the ancient Near East. Sumerian and Akkadian literature describes Dilmun, a land of eternal life and flowing water, where the gods walked among lush trees. Later, Hebrew texts would describe Eden, a garden watered by 4 rivers, filled with every tree, pleasant to the sight and good for food. In these traditions, the garden is the archetype of paradise, green, abundant, and divine. The Hanging Gardens fit seamlessly into this imagery, appearing to later generations as a human attempt to replicate Eden in stone and soil. Greek writers, too, infused the gardens with mythic overtones. To them, Babylon was already a city of wonder, with walls so vast and temples so high that they seemed almost otherworldly. Adding a man-made mountain of trees and flowers elevated it further into the realm of marvel. Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, though ostensibly geographers, described the gardens with language that blurred fact and fable, emphasizing the miracle of their construction. The very idea that rivers could be lifted into the sky to sustain trees defied natural order, making the gardens a symbol of human defiance against nature's limits. The legend of Amytis, longing for her homeland's mountains, deepens the mythic resonance. Here, the gardens become not only an engineering feat but a love story, a paradise created for a queen's heart. The romantic motif gave the wonder an emotional core, aligning it with myths of gods who build worlds for their consorts, or mortals who labor for love. In this version, Nebuchadnezzar was less conqueror than creator of Eden for Amytis. Whether factual or not, the story's survival speaks to humanity's desire to believe that wonders are built for love as much as for glory. The symbolic weight of the gardens also lies in their ephemerality. Unlike pyramids or temples, gardens are living things. They require constant water, care, and renewal. Their beauty fades when neglected. To imagine the Hanging Gardens is to imagine a wonder that could never last, paradise always on the brink of vanishing. This quality has linked them, in the modern imagination, with myths of lost Edens and forgotten golden ages. They embody the human longing for a paradise that slips away, half-remembered but never entirely lost. Later traditions wove the gardens into biblical and classical frameworks. The Hebrew Bible never mentions the Hanging Gardens, but Babylon itself looms large as a place of exile, pride, and divine judgment. Later Jewish and Christian interpreters, reflecting on Babylon's grandeur, may have folded the gardens into visions of the city's arrogance, humans striving to build heaven on earth. The gardens thus became not only a wonder but a moral tale, representing both abundance and hubris. In classical literature, the gardens often served as a shorthand for luxury and excess. Babylon, to Greek and Roman authors, symbolized opulence, wealth, and decadence. The Hanging Gardens epitomized this image, a king so rich and powerful that he could build a mountain of greenery in the desert. In Roman poetry, to invoke Babylonian gardens was to invoke extravagance, a world of gilded wonders beyond necessity. Over time, the gardens merged into the broader myth of paradise that traveled across cultures. The Persian kings built their own paradisa, walled gardens filled with flowing water and shade. Later Islamic traditions would envision Jannah, the Garden of Heaven, as lush, irrigated, filled with trees and rivers. Renaissance artists, inspired by ancient texts, painted images of the Hanging Gardens as idealized landscapes, half real, half Eden. In each retelling, the gardens became less a specific place than a universal symbol of human longing for green abundance in dry lands, for order in chaos, for paradise regained. Modern fascination continues this tradition. Writers and artists conjure images of the Hanging Gardens in novels, films, and paintings, often depicting them as impossibly lush mountains of greenery, waterfalls spilling from terraces, exotic birds soaring among branches. Archaeologists debate their location, but for most people, their reality lies not in excavation but in imagination. The gardens endure as a metaphor for lost beauty, for wonders that exist more in memory than in stone. This mythic endurance also explains why the Hanging Gardens remain one of the seven wonders despite lacking archaeological proof. The list of wonders was not a catalog of surviving monuments, but a catalog of marvels that stirred human awe. The gardens did not need to exist physically to fulfill that role. Their power lay in their ability to embody humanity's deepest dreams, to create paradise, to conquer nature, to transform exile into home, to make the desert bloom. In the end, the Hanging Gardens exist most powerfully in myth and memory. They are real because they are remembered. Whether Nebuchadnezzar built them for Amytas, whether Sennacherib raised them in Nineveh, or whether they were born only of Greek imagination, their symbolic truth is undeniable. They are humanity's story of paradise in the desert, a dream of Eden made by human hands. The gardens remind us that not all wonders are built of stone. Some are built of stories, preserved by words rather than walls. And sometimes, those wonders endure longer than any monument. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon hold a peculiar distinction among the seven wonders of the ancient world. Unlike the Great Pyramid of Giza, the only wonder still standing, or the statue of Zeus at Olympia, which left fragments and descriptions in abundance, the gardens have left no ruins, no inscriptions, no definitive proof of their existence. And yet, they remain on the canonical list, occupying as firm a place in cultural memory as monuments of stone. To understand why, we must explore not only the legend of the gardens themselves, but also the history of the Seven Wonders tradition and the values it embodied. The earliest lists of wonders date to the Hellenistic world, particularly to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Greek travelers and writers, newly freed by Alexander's conquests to explore lands from Egypt to Mesopotamia, compiled catalogs of the most astonishing human creations they encountered or heard of. These lists were not static. Some included monuments like the walls of Babylon or the Temple of Solomon. Over time, however, the canon crystallized into the seven wonders known today: the Great Pyramid, the Hanging Gardens, the statue of Zeus, the Temple of Artemis, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Why 7? In Greek thought, 7 was a sacred and symbolic number, representing perfection and completion. The wonders were intended to be not merely the greatest monuments, but a microcosm of human achievement, 7 examples of humanity at its most ambitious. They were not chosen simply for size, but for the awe they inspired, the way they seemed to bridge earth and heaven. The inclusion of the Hanging Gardens in this canon is telling. The Greeks who compiled the list had likely never seen the gardens themselves. They were relying on second-hand accounts, descriptions passed down from earlier travelers and historians. What mattered was not proof, but wonder. The very idea of a mountain of greenery raised above the desert, irrigated by hidden machines, was enough to inspire awe. The Greeks, fascinated by artifice and nature's conquest, saw in the gardens the embodiment of human ingenuity. Whether or not they stood was almost irrelevant. They deserved a place among the wonders because they captured the imagination. It is also significant that Babylon itself loomed large in Greek consciousness. Herodotus, the father of history, described its massive walls and temples in the 5th century BCE, though he made no mention of the gardens. By the time of Alexander the Great, Babylon was both a city of ruins and of legend. When Alexander entered Babylon in 331 BCE, he He marveled at its size and splendor. Later writers, reflecting on the city's reputation, may have attached the wonder of the gardens to Babylon simply because it was the city most deserving of marvels. Even if the gardens never stood there, Babylon's fame ensured they belonged to it in memory. The contrast between the gardens and other wonders is instructive. The Great Pyramid was ancient even in Greek times, a relic of a distant civilization, its endurance itself a marvel. The Colossus of Rhodes, though short-lived, was a spectacular feat of scale and symbolism. The Lighthouse of Alexandria represented cutting-edge engineering. In each case, the wonders embodied both power and ingenuity. The Hanging Gardens fit this mold perfectly, at least in story. They combined engineering, hidden irrigation devices, with power, a king reshaping nature, and beauty, lush greenery in a barren land. Even if uncertain in fact, they were certain in meaning. Moreover, the gardens represented something none of the other wonders did: living nature. All the other wonders were stone, marble, or bronze, monuments of permanence. The gardens were ephemeral, a blend of architecture and life. They symbolized not only human strength, but also the ability to nurture, to create abundance where none should exist. This made them unique among the wonders, balancing the list with an image of paradise alongside monuments of triumph and tombs of the dead. The place of the gardens in the wonders list also reflects Greek fascination with the East. For Hellenistic writers, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia were lands of marvels, exotic and rich. The gardens, ascribed to Babylon, embodied that fascination. They represented both the luxury and the mystery of the Orient as imagined by Greek minds: abundance beyond necessity, beauty beyond reason, engineering beyond comprehension. To include them was to acknowledge the cultural richness of lands beyond Greece. But their inclusion also raises a philosophical question. What makes a wonder a wonder? Is it material proof, or is it the power to inspire awe? The Hanging Gardens challenge the notion that wonders must be real in stone. Their place on the list suggests that wonder itself is enough. Even if they were legend powerful enough to shape imagination across centuries. In this sense, they fulfill the purpose of the wonders list better than some monuments that actually stood. Modern scholars sometimes view their inclusion as an embarrassment, pointing to the lack of evidence. Yet one might argue that the gardens' absence is precisely what secures their immortality. The Great Pyramid can be measured, the lighthouse reconstructed, the mausoleum excavated. The Hanging Gardens remain elusive, and in their elusiveness lies their mystique. They remind us that wonder is not only about what we can touch, but also about what we can dream. Thus, the gardens' place among the seven wonders is both deserved and paradoxical. They may never have stood in Babylon, or anywhere at all, yet they have stood for millennia in imagination, more enduring in myth than many real monuments were in stone. The seven wonders were not a checklist of archaeological certainty, but a celebration of human aspiration. In that sense, the Hanging Gardens deserve their place as much as any pyramid or colossus. They remind us that wonder is not always about permanence. Sometimes it is about fragility, ephemerality, and memory. A garden can vanish in a season, but if remembered in story, it can outlast stone. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon hold a peculiar distinction among the seven wonders of the ancient world. Unlike the Great Pyramid of Giza, the only wonder still standing, or the statue of Zeus at Olympia, which left fragments and descriptions in abundance, the gardens have left no ruins, no inscriptions, no definitive proof of their existence. And yet, they remain on the canonical list, occupying as firm a place in cultural memory as monuments of stone. To understand why, we must explore not only the legend of the gardens themselves, but also the history of the Seven Wonders tradition and the values it embodied. The earliest lists of wonders date to the Hellenistic world, particularly to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Greek travelers and writers, newly freed by Alexander's conquests to explore lands from Egypt to Mesopotamia, compiled catalogs of the most astonishing human creations they encountered or heard of. These lists were not static. Some included monuments like the walls of Babylon or the Temple of Solomon. Over time, however, the canon crystallized into the seven wonders known today: the Great Pyramid, the Hanging Gardens, the statue of Zeus, the temple of Artemis, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the lighthouse of Alexandria. Why 7? In Greek thought, 7 was a sacred and symbolic number, representing perfection and completion. The wonders were intended to be not merely the greatest monuments, but a microcosm of human achievement, 7 examples of humanity at its most ambitious. They were not chosen simply for size, but for the awe they inspired, the way they seemed to bridge earth and heaven. The inclusion of the Hanging Gardens in this canon is telling. The Greeks who compiled the list had likely never seen the gardens themselves. They were relying on second-hand accounts, descriptions passed down from earlier travelers and historians. What mattered was not proof, but wonder. The very idea of a mountain of greenery raised above the desert, irrigated by hidden machines, was enough to inspire awe. The Greeks, fascinated by artifice and nature's conquest, saw in the gardens the embodiment of human ingenuity. Whether or not they stood was almost irrelevant. They deserved a place among the wonders because they captured the imagination. It is also significant that Babylon itself loomed large in Greek consciousness. Herodotus, the father of history, described its massive walls and temples in the 5th century BCE, though he made no mention of the gardens. By the time of Alexander the Great, Babylon was both a city of ruins and of legend. When Alexander entered Babylon in 331 BCE, he marveled at its size and splendor. Later writers, reflecting on the city's reputation, may have attached the wonder of the gardens to Babylon simply because it was the city most deserving of marvels. Even if the gardens never stood there, Babylon's fame ensured they belonged to it in memory. The contrast between the gardens and other wonders is instructive. The Great Pyramid was ancient even in Greek times, a relic of a distant civilization, its endurance itself a marvel. The Colossus of Rhodes, though short-lived, was a spectacular feat of scale and symbolism. The lighthouse of Alexandria represented cutting-edge engineering. In each case, the wonders embodied both power and ingenuity. The Hanging Gardens fit this mold perfectly, at least in story. They combined engineering, hidden irrigation devices, with power, a king reshaping nature, and beauty, lush greenery in a barren land. Even if uncertain in fact, they were certain in meaning. Moreover, the gardens represented something none of the other wonders did: living nature. All the other wonders were stone, marble, or bronze, monuments of permanence. The gardens were ephemeral, a blend of architecture and life. They symbolized not only human strength, but also the ability to nurture, to create abundance where none should exist. This made them unique among the wonders, balancing the list with an image of paradise alongside monuments of triumph and tombs of the dead. The place of the gardens in the wonders list also reflects Greek fascination with the East. For Hellenistic writers, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia were lands of marvels, exotic and rich. The gardens, ascribed to Babylon, embodied that fascination. They represented both the luxury and the mystery of the Orient as imagined by Greek minds: abundance beyond necessity, beauty beyond reason, engineering beyond comprehension. To include them was to acknowledge the cultural richness of lands beyond Greece. But their inclusion also raises a philosophical question. What makes a wonder a wonder? Is it material proof, or is it the power to inspire awe? The Hanging Gardens challenge the notion that wonders must be real in stone. Their place on the list suggests that wonder itself is enough. Even if they were legend powerful enough to shape imagination across centuries. In this sense, they fulfill the purpose of the wonders list better than some monuments that actually stood. Modern scholars sometimes view their inclusion as an embarrassment, pointing to the lack of evidence. Yet one might argue that the gardens' absence is precisely what secures their immortality. The Great Pyramid can be measured, the lighthouse reconstructed, the mausoleum excavated. The Hanging Gardens remain elusive, and in their elusiveness lies their mystique. They remind us that wonder is not only about what we can touch, but also about what we can dream. Thus, the gardens' place among the 7 wonders is both deserved and paradoxical. They may never have stood in Babylon, or anywhere at all. Yet they have stood for millennia in imagination, more enduring in myth than many real monuments were in stone. The 7 wonders were not a checklist of archaeological certainty, but a celebration of human aspiration. In that sense, the Hanging Gardens deserve their place as much as any pyramid or colossus. They remind us that wonder is not always about permanence. Sometimes it is about fragility, ephemerality, and memory. A garden can vanish in a season, but if remembered in story, it can outlast stone. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon may be the most mysterious of the seven wonders because they live as much in the imagination of later ages as in the descriptions of ancient historians. Nowhere did that imagination burn more brightly, or more fiercely, than in the biblical tradition. For the Hebrew prophets, Babylon was not merely a city, it was a symbol of human arrogance, divine judgment, and exile. The gardens, though never mentioned directly in Scripture, became bound up with that larger image. Babylon as paradise turned pride, a garden that was both gift and warning. Babylon's role in the Hebrew Bible is unmistakable. It was Nebuchadnezzar II who destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE, carrying its people into exile. For the Judeans, Babylon was thus the city of captivity, the place where they wept by the rivers, Psalm 137, longing for Zion. Its grandeur was inseparable from their suffering. The book of Daniel paints Nebuchadnezzar as a proud monarch who boasted of his works, only to be humbled by God. Isaiah prophesied Babylon's downfall, likening it to fallen Eden, where beauty becomes desolation. In Revelation, centuries later, Babylon the Great became the ultimate symbol of worldly corruption. Within this moral framework, the Hanging Gardens, whether real or imagined, fit perfectly. If Nebuchadnezzar truly built them for Amitis, then they were an act of love and creativity. But for biblical writers, such a marvel would also be proof of hubris, humanity reaching for divine paradise through human effort. To them, gardens were symbols of divine order, Eden at creation, vineyards as blessings, fields as signs of covenant faithfulness. A man-made Eden in Babylon, however, would be suspect, a false paradise built by an enemy of God's people. This information has not been verified. Later Jewish and Christian interpreters picked up this thread. Church fathers such as Jerome and Augustine used Babylon as allegory for human pride and decadence. Medieval commentators, when speaking of the seven wonders, sometimes frame the Hanging Gardens as emblematic of vanity, a king spending resources on artificial beauty while oppressing conquered peoples. Renaissance writers, fascinated by classical accounts, likewise placed the gardens within a moral dichotomy, admiration for their ingenuity, suspicion of their excess. This moral ambivalence also colored Islamic perspectives. The Quran never mentions the Hanging Gardens, but Babylon appears as a place of sorcery and trial. Islamic historians, drawing on both Greek and biblical sources, repeated stories of Nebuchadnezzar's might and arrogance. In that context, the gardens were sometimes recalled as marvels of engineering, but also as worldly luxuries contrasted with spiritual truths. The persistence of this moral lens shows how powerfully gardens function as symbols. In biblical tradition, gardens are often tied to moral or spiritual states. Eden as innocence, vineyards as blessing, wilderness as judgment. A garden is never neutral. It is either the sign of divine favor or the setting for human failure. The Hanging Gardens, placed in Babylon, carried that symbolic weight automatically. They became, in imagination, not only an earthly paradise but also a warning. Paradise built without God becomes pride, and pride leads to ruin. The paradox deepens when we recall that Babylon was also remembered in later Jewish texts as a place of intellectual flowering. In exile, the Jews compiled scriptures, developed traditions, and later produced the Babylonian Talmud, one of Judaism's greatest achievements. Babylon was both oppressor and incubator, both exile and renewal. In that sense, the gardens mirror the ambiguity of Babylon itself, both wonder and warning, both paradise and exile. Outside biblical tradition, classical and medieval travelers echoed similar moral reflections. When later generations wrote of the Hanging Gardens, they often described them with both awe and suspicion. Awe, because they symbolized human mastery over nature. Suspicion, because they represented luxury and excess in a world where most lived simply. This tension has continued into modern times. Archaeologists admire the ingenuity implied, while moralists see in the gardens a symbol of waste and vanity. Art and literature further shaped this moral image. Renaissance paintings depicted the gardens as vast terraces, filled with exotic plants and fountains, often with Nebuchadnezzar and Amytas at their center. Yet such depictions often carried implicit moral commentary. Paradise created at human whim, destined to fall like the city itself. In Romantic poetry, the gardens became symbols of longing, nostalgia, and the fragility of beauty, reminders that all earthly paradises fade. The gardens' moral resonance is intensified by their mystery. Because no ruins confirm them, they remain half legend, half symbol, free to be reinterpreted by each age. For the Judeans in exile, they were a backdrop for prideful Babylon. For the Greeks, they were a marvel of engineering. For Christians, they symbolized worldly vanity. For modern scholars, they are a riddle of history. Their very uncertainty makes them pliable to meaning, mirrors for human hopes and fears. This moral ambiguity is also part of why they endure among the seven wonders. A pyramid or lighthouse can inspire awe through sheer presence. But the Hanging Gardens inspire reflection. They force us to ask, why build paradise? For love? For power? For pride? Their story contains both nobility and vanity, both tenderness and hubris. Nebuchadnezzar's gesture to Amytas, if true, shows devotion. His city's grandeur shows ambition. The exile he caused shows cruelty. The gardens hold all these contradictions in a single image: paradise and prison, wonder and warning. In this sense, the Hanging Gardens stand not only as a lost monument, but as a moral parable. They remind us that human ingenuity can create wonders, but that wonders can be tainted by pride. They show that paradise, when built in exile, can be both solace and sorrow. They reveal how every marvel carries a shadow, how beauty and hubris often grow together. Thus, the gardens live not only in Greek geographies, but in biblical imagination and moral reflection. They are a wonder of the world, but also a mirror of the soul. Babylon fell, as prophets foretold, but the image of its gardens endures, a symbol of paradise gained and lost, of humans striving for heaven, and of the judgment that follows pride. Even if the Hanging Gardens of Babylon never existed in stone, they lived on in spirit. Their image, terraces of greenery, flowing water, paradise conjured by human hands, echoed through centuries, shaping how later cultures conceived of gardens, paradise, and the very relationship between humanity and nature. In Persia, in Islamic civilization, and eventually in Europe, the idea of a garden as earthly Eden owes much to the shadow of Babylon's legendary terraces. The gardens may be lost, but their influence is everywhere. Gardens have been built to symbolize abundance, power, and transcendence. The most direct descendants of the Hanging Gardens are the Persian paradisa, walled gardens that gave us the very word paradise. The Achaemenid kings, who succeeded Babylon and ruled an empire from the 6th to the 4th centuries BCE, made gardens central to their royal identity. At Pasargadae, the palace of Cyrus the Great, archaeologists have found traces of geometric garden layouts with channels of water dividing plots into quadrants. These gardens were not decorative alone. They were cosmic symbols, representing order imposed on nature, abundance drawn from barren landscapes, and the king's role as provider. The word paradisa combined enclosure and fertility, the same paradox embodied by the Hanging Gardens, man-made order imposed to replicate natural paradise. The Persian gardens differed in form from the terraced mountain described by the Greeks, but they carried the same meaning. Water was channeled through canals, trees were arranged to provide shade, and flowers bloomed in carefully planned harmony. In a land where aridity was the norm, the presence of lush gardens testified to power and divine favor. To walk in a royal garden was to step into another world, a controlled Eden in the desert. Greek and Roman visitors were astonished by these paradises, and echoes of their marvels appear in classical literature. The Persian paradisa thus became the model for garden traditions across the Middle East and later the world. When Islam arose centuries later, it inherited both the Persian and biblical visions of paradise as a garden. The Quran describes Jannah, the Garden of Heaven, as a place of flowing rivers, shade, and fruit-bearing trees. The imagery is strikingly similar to that of the Hanging Gardens and earlier Near Eastern paradises. Water where water is scarce, greenery where greenery is rare, abundance where survival is precarious. Islamic rulers, inspired by these images, built gardens as earthly reflections of divine promise. The Alhambra in Spain, the gardens of Isfahan, the Mughal gardens of India, all draw upon this ancient tradition of gardens as metaphors for paradise. The Hanging Gardens themselves were sometimes cited by Islamic historians as an example of ancient marvels, though often in skeptical tones. Some writers described Nebuchadnezzar's green terraces, but framed them as symbols of worldly pride. Yet, even when criticized, they served as touchstones for the idea of gardens as wonders of engineering and abundance. The connection between the human-made paradise of Babylon and the divinely promised paradise of Islam was never far. The one was earthly and fragile, the other eternal and perfect, but both embodied the same longing: to turn desert into garden, to find shade and heat, to see abundance where nature offered scarcity. In medieval Europe, the legend of the Hanging Gardens filtered through classical texts and biblical imagery. For Christian thinkers, Babylon remained a symbol of pride and judgment, but the image of a man-made garden remained compelling. Renaissance humanists, rediscovering Greek and Roman accounts, painted the gardens as symbols of love and ingenuity. Artists depicted vast terraces, fountains, and exotic trees, often with Amytas gazing from the heights. These images inspired European aristocrats to build their own terraced gardens, from Italy's villas to France's formal parks. The dream of a garden that conquered nature was universal. The influence of the gardens also shaped literary imagination. Paradise Lost by John Milton evokes Eden as a lush garden, but its imagery, rivers flowing, terraces of trees, abundance and order, echoes traditions that can be traced back to Babylon and Persia. Romantic poets later invoked the Hanging Gardens as symbols of longing, beauty, and transience. For them, the gardens represented the fragility of paradise, the impossibility of holding onto perfection. In the 19th century, travelers to Mesopotamia searched for ruins of the gardens, bringing home not stones, but inspiration for landscapes and poetry. Even in modern times, echoes of the gardens appear. The design of botanical gardens, terraced parks, and hanging vertical gardens and skyscrapers all play on the same motif. Greenery where it does not belong, beauty created in defiance of nature. The gardens of Singapore's Marina Bay Sands or the vertical forests of Milan are, in a sense, modern heirs to Babylon's legend, living testaments to humanity's continuing desire to build paradise in unlikely places. The persistence of the idea shows how deeply the Hanging Gardens have embedded themselves in cultural memory. Even if they were never built in Babylon, their legend shaped real gardens across Persia, Islam, and Europe. They provided not only a model but a justification. To build a garden was to participate in the tradition of kings, to claim a piece of paradise. A Persian paradisa, an Andalusian courtyard, a Mughal charbagh, a European villa terrace, all stand in a lineage that includes Babylon's phantom wonder. The moral lessons of the gardens also persisted. For some, they were symbols of love, as in the story of Amytas. For others, they were warnings of pride, like Babylon itself. For still others, they were proofs of human ingenuity, marvels of engineering and imagination. Their ambiguity, love, pride, ingenuity, made them adaptable to every culture. Each saw in them what it wanted: a king's devotion, a tyrant's arrogance, or humanity's brilliance. What makes the Hanging Gardens so enduring is that they bridge myth and reality. We may never know if they stood in Babylon, Nineveh, or only in story, but their influence is visible in the real gardens of Persia, Islam, and Europe. They are proof that sometimes the most powerful monuments are not those built in stone, but those built in imagination. A pyramid can crumble, a lighthouse can fall, but a story can inspire new creations for millennia. Thus, the Hanging Gardens are not lost. They live in the terraces of Pasargadae, in the fountains of Isfahan, in the courtyards of the Alhambra, in the manicured lawns of Versailles, in the rooftop gardens of modern cities. Each is an echo of the original legend, a fragment of the dream of Babylon. Gardens lost, gardens found. Always recreated, always remembered, always reaching back to the wonder of greenery hanging above the desert. Few ancient mysteries inspire as much debate as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Unlike the Great Pyramid, whose stones speak for themselves, the gardens exist only in words, leaving scholars to puzzle over where, if anywhere, they stood. Were they in Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar II for his Median queen, Amytis? Or were they in Nineveh, engineered by Sennacherib, the Assyrian king who prided himself on waterworks? Modern scholarship has sharpened this debate, using archaeology, philology, and climatology to weigh the evidence. The result is not certainty, but a fascinating clash of interpretations that reveals as much about modern values as about ancient ruins. The case for Babylon rests on tradition. Every classical list of the seven wonders places the gardens in Babylon. Greek authors like Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Philo of Byzantium described them as marvels of Nebuchadnezzar's city. Later legends linked them to his queen Amytis, making them both political and romantic monuments. Babylon's fame as a city of marvels supports this placement. Its walls, temples, and palaces were already legendary. For ancient travelers, it seemed natural that the gardens, too, belonged there. Archaeology, however, has struggled to confirm this. Excavations at Babylon, particularly those led by Robert Coldway in the early 20th century, uncovered massive palaces, gates, and temples, but no definitive remains of the gardens. Coldway identified a vaulted structure near the southern palace as a possible foundation, unusual in its use of stone and thickness. He proposed it might have supported terrace gardens. Yet no irrigation system or traces of soil were found. Critics argue it was a storeroom or barracks, not a wonder. The Euphrates, which once flowed through Babylon, has shifted course, possibly erasing evidence. Still, the absence of inscriptional or archaeological proof weakens the Babylonian case. The silence of Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions is particularly striking. He left dozens of building texts boasting of his works: the Ishtar Gate, the Processional Way, the Sagila Temple. He proclaimed, "I have made Babylon the marvel of the nations." Yet not once does he mention gardens. For a ruler so eager to claim glory, such omission is puzzling. Was the project too private? Or was it never built at all? This information has not been verified. The case for Nineveh, championed by Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, is based on stronger archaeological and textual evidence. Sennacherib, r. 705 to 681 BCE, transformed Nineveh into a palace without rival. His inscriptions describe gardens irrigated by canals and aqueducts that brought water from the mountains. He boasted of planting trees from across his empire and of inventing devices to raise water, bronze cylinders that scholars interpret as water screws or pumps. The aqueduct at Jerwin, still standing, confirms his hydraulic ambitions. Reliefs from his palace depict lush gardens with flowing streams, echoing Greek descriptions of terraced greenery. Daly argues that Greek writers misattributed these gardens to Babylon due to confusion or Babylon's greater fame. By the time of the Hellenistic world, Nineveh had been destroyed 612 BCE, while Babylon remained renowned. Travelers hearing tales of Mesopotamian gardens may have attached them to Babylon, the city they knew. Daly also suggests that errors in translating cuneiform names, confusing Nineveh's Nineveh with Babylon, may have contributed. Her case reframes the wonder as Assyrian, not Babylonian, shifting its location by hundreds of miles. Critics of the Nineveh theory raise objections. While Sennacherib's gardens were impressive, no Greek text mentions Nineveh, all say Babylon. Could centuries of writers have been so mistaken? Moreover, the reliefs depict landscape parks, not necessarily terraced mountains like those described by Diodorus. Some argue Daly overstates the evidence, reinterpreting Greek texts through Assyrian lenses. Skeptics caution that the Nineveh theory solves some problems but creates others. Other scholars propose hybrid theories. Perhaps both cities had gardens. Nebuchadnezzar may have built lush courtyards or terraces that later inspired legend, while Sennacherib built more elaborate hydraulic parks. Over centuries, travelers may have conflated traditions, merging details into one iconic wonder. The gardens, then, could be less a single structure than a composite memory of Mesopotamian horticultural marvels. The debate reflects deeper tensions in archaeology and historiography. Should we trust ancient texts, even when archaeology is silent? Or should we privilege material remains, even when they contradict tradition? The Babylon versus Nineveh debate pits text against ruin, memory against stone. The answer depends partly on what we think a wonder is: a literal structure to be proven, or a cultural idea preserved in imagination. The debate also reveals modern fascination with lost wonders. The garden's mystery keeps them alive. If ruins were found tomorrow, the allure might diminish. As long as evidence is partial and ambiguous, they remain fertile ground for speculation. Their absence becomes part of their identity, the only wonder that may never have existed, yet the one that endures most vividly in imagination. In 2013, Daly summarized her findings in The Mystery of the Hanging Garden of Babylon, presenting the Nineveh case to a wider audience. Her argument has captured public imagination but remains contested in academia. Excavations at both Babylon and Nineveh continue, but the geopolitical instability of Iraq has hindered progress. Until more evidence is uncovered, if ever, the debate will remain unresolved. What is certain is that Mesopotamian kings built gardens that astonished their subjects. Whether in Babylon or Nineveh, terraced greenery, exotic plants, and hydraulic ingenuity were real features of ancient urban life. The legend of the Hanging Gardens may be an amalgam of these realities, crystallized in Greek imagination into a single wonder. In the end, the debate is less about solving a puzzle than about appreciating the interplay of memory, myth, and material culture. The Hanging Gardens remind us that history is not only what is found in the ground, but also what is remembered in stories. Archaeology sharpens the mystery, but does not dispel it. Babylon or Nineveh, real or imagined, the gardens endure because they exist at the threshold of proof and dream. Among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are unique not only for their uncertain location, but also for their complete disappearance. The Great Pyramid still towers above Giza. Fragments of the mausoleum at Halicarnassus and the Temple of Artemis remain. Even the Lighthouse of Alexandria is remembered in submerged ruins. The gardens, however, left nothing behind. Not a stone terrace, not a carved relief, not even an inscription from the king supposedly responsible. How could a wonder so magnificent simply vanish? The answer lies in the inherent fragility of gardens, the impermanence of water-driven architecture, and the tides of history that erased both stone and memory. The first reason is botanical. Unlike pyramids or statues, gardens are living things. Their glory depends on soil, water, and continual care. The very trees and flowers that made the Hanging Gardens miraculous would also have been their most fleeting feature. Without constant irrigation, greenery would wither in weeks under Mesopotamia's scorching sun. The fruit trees, cedars, and vines described by Greek writers could not survive neglect. If the gardens fell into disuse after the death of their patron king, they would have dried and died swiftly, leaving only barren terraces of stone. The living part of the wonder was destined to be temporary, more fragile than marble or granite. The second reason is structural. If the gardens were indeed supported by vaulted stonework filled with soil, then water seepage would have been a perpetual danger. Even with bitumen waterproofing, Mesopotamian builders struggled with water damage, as seen in canals and temples. Over decades or centuries, leaking irrigation could have weakened walls, leading to collapse. Maintenance would have been constant and costly. Once abandoned, the structures may have crumbled rapidly. Unlike pyramids designed to last forever, the gardens were designed to live only through continuous human effort. The third reason lies in geography. Babylon and Nineveh were cities on rivers, Babylon on the Euphrates, Nineveh on the Tigris. Both rivers have shifted course over millennia, flooding and eroding sections of their cities. Entire quarters of Babylon now lie beneath silt or modern riverbeds. If the gardens were near the river, as some Greek descriptions suggest, their remains may have been washed away. Stone foundations could have been dismantled for reuse in later constructions, a common fate for ancient buildings. The Euphrates and Tigris were as destructive as they were life-giving, swallowing evidence as efficiently as they nurtured gardens. The fourth reason is historical destruction. Babylon and Nineveh both fell violently. Nineveh was sacked in 612 BCE by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. Its palaces burned, its walls breached. Babylon was conquered repeatedly by the Persians, by Alexander the Great, by the Parthians, and declined into ruin. In each conquest, monuments were looted, walls dismantled, and palaces repurposed. A structure as elaborate as terrace gardens would have been difficult to maintain through such upheavals. Once empires fell, no successors had incentive to preserve their marvels. The gardens of kings became the rubble of enemies. The absence of inscriptions compounds the mystery. Nebuchadnezzar boasted of his walls and temples, but not of gardens. If he did not record them, later rulers had no reason to preserve them. In Assyria, Sennacherib did describe his gardens, but his inscriptions focus more on aqueducts and canals than on terraces. Without explicit textual anchors, later generations could not easily identify or restore these monuments. Silence in records led to silence in ruins. Another factor is cultural perception. For the Greeks, writing centuries later, the gardens were a marvel worth immortalizing. For Mesopotamian kings, gardens may have been seen as extensions of royal parks rather than monuments. Palaces and temples symbolized divine power and royal legitimacy. Gardens symbolized abundance, but perhaps did not warrant the same permanence in stone inscriptions. Thus, while the Greeks preserved their memory in literature, Mesopotamians let them fade without record. The fragility of the gardens also reveals a deeper truth. They were never meant to last forever. Unlike tombs or temples, they were living spectacles, tied to the reign and identity of a single king. If Nebuchadnezzar built them for Amytis, they symbolized marital devotion. Once she was gone, their meaning diminished. If Sennacherib built them for Nineveh, they symbolized imperial abundance. When Assyria fell, they lost their purpose. Wonders that depend on living memory, not eternal stone, are always vulnerable to erasure. Modern analogies help us grasp this ephemerality. Consider Versailles Gardens or Mughal India's Charbagh Gardens. When abandoned, fountains dried, and gardeners dismissed, they quickly decayed into wilderness. Unlike pyramids, gardens must be continually remade. The Hanging Gardens, if real, were Versailles in Mesopotamia, lavish, lush, and inherently impermanent. Their disappearance is not surprising but inevitable, and yet, their very vanishing is part of their wonder. Because they left no ruins, they became symbols of absence, reminders of how fragile human creations are. The Great Pyramid impresses by enduring, the Hanging Gardens haunt by vanishing. They embody the paradox of beauty. Its greatest expression is often fleeting. A flower is more fragile than a stone, but its memory lingers more powerfully because of that fragility. The gardens also remind us of the dependence of human civilization on environment. They were made possible only through mastery of water, and when water failed, through drought, conquest, or neglect. They could not survive. They are metaphors for human control over nature, but also for the limits of that control. Rivers shift, empires fall, and gardens die. The absence of remains is the ultimate testimony. Paradise, no matter how glorious, cannot be preserved by force alone. Their disappearance also explains their enduring allure. Had archaeologists uncovered terraces with irrigation systems, the Hanging Gardens would be admired but explained. Because nothing remains, they remain mysteries, their existence forever debated, their image forever reimagined. The absence itself sustains their legend, making them the most evocative of the wonders. They are not monuments we can measure, but stories we can dream. Thus, the Hanging Gardens vanished because they were always destined to vanish. Built of soil and water, dependent on labor and love, they could not endure conquest, neglect, and time. Their stones may have crumbled, their trees withered, their rivers shifted. But their memory endured, carried by Greek words and human imagination. The wonder that left nothing behind remains, paradoxically, the most enduring in cultural memory. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or Nineveh, or nowhere, have endured less as physical remains than as symbols. They are the most metaphorical of the seven wonders, understood not as monuments of stone, but as allegories of human desire, royal ambition, and cultural imagination. Over centuries, they have been interpreted as symbols of power, as testaments of love, and as warnings of hubris. Whether real or imagined, they have become a canvas onto which each age projects its hopes and fears. First and foremost, the gardens embody power. To command a desert to bloom, to lift rivers into the air, to plant exotic trees in terraces of stone, these are feats of dominance. In the ancient Near East, kingship was measured not only in conquests, but in the ability to control nature. Canals, irrigation, and orchards were signs of divine favor and royal legitimacy. A king who made the desert green proved himself as steward of fertility and abundance. The Hanging Gardens, therefore, symbolize the apex of this ideal, a ruler who could replicate mountains, forests, and rivers within his city. Babylon and Nineveh were cities of mud brick, yet their kings dreamed of cedar groves and waterfalls. By engineering paradise, they demonstrated not just wealth, but cosmic authority. This aspect of the gardens resonates across cultures. Later Persian rulers built their paradisa as demonstrations of imperial grandeur. Mughal emperors laid out charbagh gardens as statements of order imposed on chaos. In each case, gardens were political acts, proclaiming that rulers could bend the environment to their will. The Hanging Gardens, as the archetype, embody this tradition, paradise as propaganda, greenery as proof of power. Yet alongside power lies the more tender reading, the gardens as symbols of love. The legend of Amytas, transplanted from the green hills of Media to the arid plain of Babylon, provides the gardens with a human heart. Nebuchadnezzar, so the story goes, built the terraces to soothe his queen's longing, recreating her homeland's mountains in the city. Whether true or not, this narrative has captured imaginations for centuries. The image of a king bending empire to comfort his wife transforms a political wonder into a personal one. It suggests that the greatest wonders are not always built for gods or glory, but for love. This romantic interpretation has proven enduring. Renaissance painters depicted Amytas gazing from the terraces, her face lifted in relief at the sight of familiar trees. Poets spoke of love powerful enough to move rivers. The gardens became symbols of devotion transcending conquest, of intimacy amid empire. For modern audiences, this reading often feels more compelling than the political one. The idea that one of the seven wonders was built for a queen's homesickness softens its grandeur with humanity. But the gardens also symbolize hubris. In biblical and moral traditions, Babylon was the city of pride, where human arrogance challenged divine order. To build a man-made Eden in such a place was to trespass on sacred ground. Eden, in Hebrew scripture, was a gift of God, not a human creation. For Nebuchadnezzar, or Sennacherib, to replicate paradise was to claim divine powers. In this sense, the gardens embody human overreach, the attempt to build heaven on earth by human hands alone. Like the Tower of Babel, they become a parable of ambition doomed to judgment. This information has not been verified. Later commentators echoed this suspicion. Christian writers saw in the gardens an image of worldly excess, a king wasting resources on artificial beauty while oppressing nations. Muslim historians, while admiring their ingenuity, sometimes framed them as examples of pride, symbols of earthly splendor contrasted with the eternal paradise of heaven. Even modern interpretations occasionally read them as metaphors for unsustainable luxury, marvels that required constant labor, destined to collapse as soon as power failed. This triple symbolism, power, love, hubris, has ensured the garden's endurance in cultural memory. Each dimension appeals to different audiences. To rulers, they symbolize political might. To lovers, they symbolize devotion. To moralists, they symbolize vanity. Few other wonders carry such layered meanings. The pyramid was a tomb, the colossus a triumph, the lighthouse a utility. The gardens are everything at once: palace, paradise, poem, and warning. Their metaphorical richness is heightened by their absence. Because no ruins constrain imagination, each culture has remade them in its own image. To the Greeks, they were engineering marvels. To the Jews, they were symbols of exile and pride. To Persians, they echoed their own paradises. To Europeans, they became romantic allegories. To modern scholars, they are puzzles of history. The lack of physical remains liberates them, allowing them to be endlessly reinterpreted. As metaphor, the gardens also speak to universal human themes. They embody the tension between nature and artifice, between what grows freely and what is imposed by design. They remind us of the desire to create paradise where it does not exist, to bend environment to imagination. They show the fragility of beauty, the inevitability of decay, the transience of abundance. They suggest that all human achievements, no matter how grand, are both marvels and mirages. The gardens also symbolize memory itself. They exist because people remembered them, retold them, and reimagined them. Memory, like a garden, must be cultivated. Without tending, it withers. The Hanging Gardens have survived not through ruins, but through words, proving that human imagination can preserve what stone cannot. They are metaphors for history itself. Partial, fragile, reconstructed from fragments, always on the border between fact and fiction. In modern times, the metaphor of the Hanging Gardens continues to flourish. Vertical gardens and skyscrapers, rooftop parks, and artificial oases are often described as Babylonian in inspiration. Writers use the gardens as shorthand for excess or utopia, depending on context. Environmentalists see them as early examples of humanity's attempt to conquer nature, warnings of the unsustainability of such endeavors. Romanticists see them as symbols of love stronger than empire. Political thinkers see them as metaphors for power that dazzles but does not endure. Perhaps this is why the Hanging Gardens endure so powerfully in imagination. They are not limited to a single meaning. They are mirrors in which each generation sees itself. Ancient Greeks saw human triumph. Hebrews saw pride. Medieval Christians saw vanity. Renaissance poets saw romance. We see mystery, fragility, and the paradox of creating paradise in an age of environmental crisis. The Hanging Gardens, then, are more than a lost wonder. They are a story about human ambition, devotion, and folly. They are a parable about the fragility of beauty, the cost of abundance, and the impermanence of power. They are, above all, a metaphor for humanity's eternal desire to build Eden again, and the reminder that every Eden, whether in stone or soil, is as fragile as the hands that tend it. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon may have vanished from the earth, but they remain deeply present in our imagination. They stand as the only wonder of the ancient world that may never have existed in stone, yet paradoxically, they are also the one that speaks most powerfully across time. The pyramids impress with their endurance, the lighthouse of Alexandria with its scale, but the gardens haunt us with their absence. They matter today not because we can see them, but because we cannot. They endure as metaphors for beauty, for fragility, and for humanity's desire to create paradise in unlikely places. One reason the gardens matter is that they embody the human longing for paradise in the midst of hardship. Mesopotamia was a land of extremes, searing summers, unpredictable rivers, and fragile harvests. To imagine a mountain of greenery in such a land was to imagine victory over suffering. The gardens symbolize the triumph of order over chaos, water over drought, beauty over dust. In our own age, where climate change threatens to turn fertile lands into deserts, the legend of the gardens speaks with fresh urgency. It reminds us of the timeless dream to bring green abundance where nature offers only scarcity. The gardens also endure because they speak to the tension between human ingenuity and nature's limits. They were, if real, feats of engineering, raising water against gravity, sustaining trees in terraces of stone. They showed what human invention could achieve, but they were also fragile, dependent on endless labor and vulnerable to neglect. Their disappearance reveals the limits of technology when not sustained. This duality makes them particularly relevant today, as we grapple with both the wonders and the perils of human innovation. We can create vertical forests, artificial islands, and climate-controlled oases, but the gardens remind us that even the most ingenious systems require care and continuity, or they too will vanish. Culturally, the gardens matter because they embody multiple layers of meaning. They are remembered as a king's gift of love, as Nebuchadnezzar's gesture to soothe Amethyst's longing for her homeland. They are remembered as propaganda, symbols of imperial abundance and power. They are remembered as hubris, Babylon's attempt to build Eden by human hands alone. Each interpretation speaks to universal human experiences: love and loss, pride and ambition, power and fragility. The gardens endure because they mean different things to different people, never reduced to a single story. They also matter as mirrors of memory. Unlike other wonders, they exist entirely in words. Their survival proves that memory can outlast material. The Hanging Gardens are gardens of the mind, cultivated by storytellers for over 2,000 years. Their absence in archaeology does not erase them, it amplifies them. They are not less real for being lost. They are more real in imagination. In an age where digital memory often eclipses physical reality, the gardens foreshadow our own paradox. What exists in stories may matter more than what exists in stone. The metaphorical weight of the gardens makes them relevant in modern discourse. Environmentalists invoke them as symbols of unsustainable luxury, a warning of what happens when human ambition overreaches. Architects cite them as precursors to vertical gardens and green urbanism, inspirations for bringing nature into cities. Lovers still reference them as emblems of devotion, proof that love can move rivers and raise mountains. The gardens have become a vocabulary of metaphor, flexible enough to serve poetry, scholarship, and politics alike. They also matter because they embody the fragility of beauty. Pyramids and temples endure because they are dead monuments, built of stone. Gardens, living and fragile, require constant care. Their beauty lies precisely in their ephemerality, in the fact that it cannot last. The Hanging Gardens remind us that the greatest wonders are often the most transient. A rose in bloom, a forest in autumn, a sunset on the horizon. These fade, yet they stay with us in memory. The gardens are the global symbol of that truth. Finally, the gardens endure because they ask us the eternal question: what is a wonder? Is it something we can measure, weigh, and excavate? Or is it something that inspires awe, even if it exists only in stories? The Hanging Gardens challenge the modern obsession with proof. They insist that imagination itself is a form of reality. They remind us that wonders are not only monuments of stone, but also monuments of the mind. In the end, the Hanging Gardens matter today because they show us the paradox of human achievement. They were at once triumphs of ingenuity and symbols of fragility. They may have been real, or they may have been legend, but their meaning transcends that debate. They are our story of paradise regained and lost, of love expressed in grandeur, of power turned to beauty, of hubris undone by time. They are the echo of Eden, not divine but human, fragile yet eternal in memory. As long as people dream of green in deserts, of love that transforms cities, of paradise restored, the Hanging Gardens will matter. Their stones may be gone, their trees long withered, their terraces lost to rivers, but their story endures, as lush and alive as ever in the gardens of imagination. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon remain the most enigmatic of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Unlike the Great Pyramid, their stones do not endure. Unlike the Lighthouse of Alexandria, their foundations cannot be traced beneath the sea. They live only in words, fragments of Greek historians, later legends of Nebuchadnezzar and Amethyst, scattered inscriptions of Assyrian kings. And yet, in their absence, they have become the most enduring wonder of all. They are not measured in ruins, but in imagination. What makes the Hanging Gardens unforgettable is not certainty, but ambiguity. They may have risen in Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar for his queen. They may have bloomed in Nineveh, sustained by Sennacherib's aqueducts. Or they may have been no more than travelers' tales, conflations of memory and myth. This information has not been verified, but it scarcely matters. The gardens survive not because they can be excavated, but because they capture the deepest longings of humanity. To create paradise where it does not belong, to soften exile with beauty, to bend nature to love and ambition. They are a parable of power. Kings who commanded armies sought also to command rivers, to make deserts bloom, and thus prove divine favor. They are a parable of love, remembered in the legend of Amethyst, whose homesickness moved a king to raise a mountain of greenery in the plains. And they are a parable of hubris, Babylon's attempt to rebuild Eden by human hands, destined, like all earthly paradises, to wither when the waters cease to flow. Their very fragility makes them timeless. Gardens are never permanent. They bloom, they fade, they demand labor and care. Once neglected, they vanish, leaving little behind. The Hanging Gardens remind us that beauty is often fleeting, and that fragility can be more haunting than endurance. The pyramids impress us by surviving. The gardens move us because they did not. Today, their echo still resonates. Architects draw inspiration for vertical gardens and green cities. Lovers invoke them as metaphors for devotion. Environmentalists see them as warnings of unsustainable ambition. Poets and storytellers continue to conjure them as lost Edens, places half real and half dream. They matter because they are not locked in the past, but alive in every culture that imagines paradise in unlikely places. The Hanging Gardens teach us that a wonder need not be proven to be true. Wonder is not only about stone, but about story, not only about endurance, but about imagination. They remind us that humanity's greatest monuments are sometimes the ones we cannot measure, the ones that exist in memory, in longing, in the refusal to forget. And so the Hanging Gardens remain, not in Babylon's ruins, not in Nineveh's aqueducts, but in the gardens of the human mind. They are paradise remembered, paradise imagined, paradise lost, and found again in every telling. They whisper across time that even when empires fall and stones crumble, beauty can endure in story. That is why they still matter. That is why they will never truly vanish.